Sometimes, desperation makes us brave enough to walk straight into danger. Sometimes the most frightening warnings come from the people trying hardest to protect us. In the remote mountains of the Devil's Backbone Range, Gideon Cole owns the most feared ranch in 3 counties. Folks whisper that every woman who's worked for him has died under mysterious circumstances. When dirt-poor Josephine Lane shows up at his door, hungry and desperate after losing everything in a prairie fire, Gideon gives her a chilling warning. Every woman who enters my ranch dies. Still want the job? Josie has nowhere else to go, so she takes the risk. What she discovers isn't a killer, but a man haunted by secrets and hunted by enemies who will stop at nothing to destroy him. As danger closes in around them, Josie realizes she might be the next target. But what happens when the woman everyone expects to die becomes the one person willing to fight back? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Blackthorn Ranch as Josephine Lane stood at the weathered porch steps, her threadbare shawl pulled tight against the mountain chill. The sprawling property stretched endlessly before her, a patchwork of golden grassland and dark timber that seemed to breathe with its own ancient rhythm. Behind her, the ranch house loomed, a massive structure of hewn logs and fieldstone that had weathered decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. Gideon Cole emerged from the barn like a force of nature itself. At 6 feet 4 inches, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who understood the weight of his own presence. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, caught the early light as he approached. The lines etched deep around his grey eyes spoke of hard years and harder choices. Everything about him seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains that surrounded his land. "You're still here," he said, his voice carrying the low rumble of distant thunder. Josie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the way it seemed to see straight through to her soul. "I said I needed the work, Mr. Cole. I meant it." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn boots, the careful mending in her dress, the proud set of her shoulders, despite the desperate circumstances that had brought her here. In her delicate features, he saw an echo of strength that reminded him of someone else, someone whose memory still haunted his dreams. "The previous women," he began, then stopped himself. His jaw tightened as if the words themselves caused physical pain. They were good women, hard-working, deserving of better than what this place brought them. Josie had heard the whispers in town during her 3-week journey west. Sarah Mitchell, found at the bottom of Devil's Creek with her skull cracked open. Elena Vasquez, discovered in the barn loft, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. And most recently, Margaret O'Brien, who simply vanished one autumn night, leaving behind only her blood-stained apron caught on a fence post. "What happened to them?" she asked quietly. Gideon's expression darkened further, if such a thing were possible. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small silver locket, its surface tarnished with age and handling. Sarah's locket, Josie knew it instinctively, though she couldn't say how. The way he held it, like a man cradling broken glass, spoke of guilt that had burrowed deep into his bones. "Accidents," he said finally, though the word sounded hollow even to his own ears. "At least, that's what Sheriff Coleman called them. This land, it's not kind to women. Not to anyone, really, but especially not to women." He tucked the locket away, but not before Josie caught sight of the initials engraved on its surface. S.M. Sarah Mitchell, the first to die. "The work is hard," Gideon continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man delivering a sermon he'd preached too many times before. "Dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. Cooking, cleaning, mending. The winters here will freeze the marrow in your bones, and the summers will bake the life right out of you. The nearest neighbor is 12 miles south, and they won't come calling. The townfolk, they have their opinions about this place, about me. You'll find no friends there." As if summoned by their conversation, an old Mexican man emerged from the shadows of the barn. Miguel Santos had worked the Blackthorn Ranch for 15 years, arriving shortly after Gideon had claimed the land with his military pension and the ghosts of too many battles. His weathered hands worked constantly at the wooden rosary beads that hung from his belt, and his dark eyes held the wisdom of a man who had seen both the best and worst that life could offer. "Patron," Miguel said with a respectful nod toward Gideon, then turned to Josie with a gentler expression. "Señorita, you should know this man. He has a good heart. But this place," he crossed himself quickly, "this place is cursed." "Miguel," Gideon's voice carried a warning edge. "No, patron. She needs to know. The land, it hungers. It takes what it wants, and it always wants the innocent ones first." Josie looked between the two men, seeing the weight of shared grief and unspoken understanding that passed between them. Whatever had happened to those three women, both men carried the burden of it. "I have a brother," Josie said suddenly, surprised by her own words. "Tommy. He's 11 years old, and he's sick. Has been since the fire took our farm back in Kansas. The smoke, it damaged his lungs. The doctor in Willow Creek says he needs clean mountain air and proper food, or he won't see another winter." She pulled a small daguerreotype from her coat pocket, its edges worn soft from handling. The image showed a thin boy with Josie's same determined jaw and bright eyes, though his face bore the pallor of chronic illness. "He's staying with the minister's family in town, but they can't keep him much longer. They've got their own mouths to feed." Her voice caught slightly. "Mr. Cole, I know you're trying to warn me away, and I appreciate the kindness of it. But Tommy is all I have left in this world, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep him alive. Even if that means working on a cursed ranch for a man the whole territory fears." Gideon stared at the photograph for a long moment, seeing in the boy's face an echo of his own younger brother, the one who died at Gettysburg, while Gideon was fighting his way through hell at Antietam. The boy who'd never gotten the chance to grow up, to see the vast beauty of these mountains, to understand that sometimes a man could find peace even after the worst horrors imaginable. $20 a month, he said finally, plus room and board. You'll have the small bedroom upstairs, the one that faces east toward the sunrise. Miguel will show you around, explain the routines. We rise at 4:30, breakfast at 5. The work starts at dawn and doesn't stop until the sun goes down behind Widow's Peak. He paused, studying her face in the growing light. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the desperate circumstances that had brought her here, there was something unbreakable in her green eyes. Something that reminded him of the women in his family, his mother, who'd held their farm together while his father fought in the Mexican War, and his sister, who'd nursed wounded soldiers until typhus took her life. "There are rules," he continued. "You don't go out after dark, not for any reason. You don't ride alone beyond the boundary markers. Miguel will show you where they are. And if anything strange happens, anything at all that makes you uneasy, you come find me immediately. Day or night, it doesn't matter." Miguel nodded approvingly at these instructions, his fingers working faster along his rosary beads. "Do you understand, Miss Lane? This isn't a request, it's the difference between life and death up here." Josie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, but she nodded firmly. "I understand, Mr. Cole, and I accept your terms." As she spoke, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the stone cliffs that surrounded the ranch like ancient sentinels. In the distance, storm clouds gathered around the highest peaks, promising rain before evening. The wind carried the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and sharp, that made the hair on the back of Josie's neck stand on end. Gideon noticed her reaction and felt his own unease deepen. 3 women had stood on this same porch, had looked out at the same magnificent and terrible landscape, had made the same bargain with fate. All 3 had been brave, determined, and desperate in their own ways. All 3 were dead. "Miguel will get you settled," he said, turning away before she could see the conflict written across his features. "I'll be working the north pasture if you need anything." As he walked away, his boots striking the wooden porch with measured steps, Josie caught sight of something that made her breath catch. Pinned to the inside of his vest, barely visible when he moved, was a small piece of paper covered in his own careful handwriting. She couldn't make out the words, but somehow she knew it was another warning, the same warning he'd given to Sarah, Elena, and Margaret. The same warning that hadn't saved any of them. Miguel approached her with a gentle smile, but his eyes remained troubled. "Come, señorita, let me show you your room, and then we'll talk about the work. But first," he pressed his rosary into her hands, the wooden beads smooth and warm from constant handling. "You keep this close. Some protections, they work better when they're shared." As Josie closed her fingers around the rosary, she felt the weight of more than just carved wood and string. She felt the weight of hope that she could be different, that she could survive what the others couldn't, that she could save her brother and maybe, just maybe, help heal whatever darkness had settled over this beautiful, cursed place. The hawk cried again overhead, and in the distance, thunder began to rumble through the peaks. The storm was coming, in more ways than one. 3 weeks into her employment at Blackthorn Ranch, Josie had settled into the demanding rhythm of frontier life. Her hands, once soft from her former life as a schoolteacher, now bore the calluses of honest labor. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast, spent her days mending clothes and tending the vegetable garden, and fell into exhausted sleep each night with the satisfaction of work well done. The ranch house itself had begun to feel less forbidding and more like home. The massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its mantel decorated with simple wooden carvings that spoke of long winter evenings and careful craftsmanship. Gideon's presence, while still imposing, had become a source of quiet comfort rather than intimidation. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight and consideration. It was while cleaning his study that Josie made the discovery that would change everything. The room served as Gideon's private sanctuary, filled with leather-bound books on military strategy, agriculture, and philosophy. A massive oak desk dominated one corner, its surface meticulously organized, despite the obvious wear of daily use. Josie had been instructed to dust the furniture, but never to disturb the papers, a boundary she had scrupulously respected until that particular morning. As she moved clean behind the desk, her elbow caught the edge of a heavy ledger, sending it tumbling to the floor. Pages scattered like fallen leaves, and as she knelt to gather them, her eyes fell upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a letter, partially burned along one edge. The paper yellowed with age and handling. The handwriting was crude, but forceful, each letter carved deep into the paper with obvious anger. "Cole, you got 1 week to pack up and get out. The Blackthorn spread belongs to men who can make proper use of it. We've been patient long enough, but our patience got limits. Every day you stay makes things harder on everyone, especially them pretty little housekeepers you keep hiring. Don't think hiding behind them skirts will protect you forever. Accidents happen to women all the time out here in the wilderness. Terrible, tragic accidents. Get out now, and maybe the next gal won't end up like the others. A friend." Josie's hands trembled as she read the words again, their meaning crystallizing like ice in her veins. This wasn't about some supernatural curse or Gideon's personal failings. Someone had been deliberately targeting the women who worked for him, using their deaths as weapons in a campaign of terror designed to drive him from his land. "Miss Lane." Gideon's voice from the doorway made her jump, the letter falling from her nerveless fingers. He stood in the threshold, his grey eyes taking in the scattered papers, the burned letter lying between them like an accusation. "I can explain," she began, but he raised a hand to silence her. "No need. I've been expecting you to find that eventually." He moved into the room with his characteristic measured steps, bending to retrieve the threatening note. "The question is, what do you intend to do with this knowledge?" Josie rose slowly, her mind racing. Those women, Sarah, Elena, Margaret, they were murdered. Yes. The simple confirmation hit her like a physical blow. And you knew. I suspected. This letter arrived 2 days after Sarah's death. Others came after Elena and Margaret died. each one making it clearer that their deaths weren't accidents, weren't the result of some curse or my own shortcomings as an employer. Then why? She struggled to find words adequate to her outrage. Why didn't you tell the sheriff? Why didn't you warn me? Gideon's expression darkened, storm clouds gathering in his eyes. I tried, Miss Lane. Sheriff Coleman investigated each death thoroughly, he assured me, found no evidence of foul play. Ruled them all accidents, despite the threats, despite the timing. Either he's the most incompetent lawman in the territory, or he's part of it. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. That's a dangerous accusation to make about a man who wears a badge. But not an impossible one. Josie's initial shock was transforming into something harder, more focused. Someone wants this ranch badly enough to kill for it. Someone with enough influence to cover up multiple murders. That takes more than just hired thugs, it takes corruption at the highest levels. Gideon studied her face, seeing the sharp intelligence that had first drawn him to hire her despite his better judgment. In her green eyes, he recognized the same analytical mind that had made her an effective teacher, now turned toward a puzzle far more deadly than any arithmetic lesson. The land, she continued, her voice gaining strength. What makes this particular ranch worth so much blood? He was quiet for a long moment, weighing the wisdom of complete honesty. Finally, he moved to a large map mounted in a frame behind his desk. The Blackthorn Ranch was marked in brown ink, its boundaries encompassing a vast swath of valley and mountain terrain. Water rights, he said simply. The Devil's Creek runs right through the heart of my property, fed by snowmelt from 3 different peaks. It's the only reliable water source for 50 miles in any direction. Control the water, control the entire region. But there's more, isn't there? Josie studied the map, noting the careful notations in Gideon's handwriting. You wouldn't fight this hard just for water. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You don't miss much, do you, Miss Lane? He pointed to a section marked with small X's along the eastern boundary. Gold. Not enough to make a man rich overnight, but enough to sustain steady mining operations for decades. And beneath the gold, his finger traced along the creek bed. The geological survey I commissioned last year found evidence of silver deposits, potentially significant ones. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. So someone's been systematically terrorizing you, using the deaths of innocent women to drive you away from a fortune in mineral wealth. That's my belief, yes. But belief and proof are 2 different things, especially when the man responsible for finding proof wears a badge and has his own interests to protect. Josie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Mr. Cole, if you've known about this for months, why did you hire me? Why put another woman at risk? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Gideon turned away from the map, his hands clasping behind his back, in a gesture she had come to recognize as his way of maintaining control when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Because I'm tired of running, he said finally, tired of letting good people die while I cower in my own home, and because, he met her eyes directly, because you're different from the others, stronger, more resilient. If anyone could survive what they have planned, help me fight back instead of becoming another victim, it would be you. The admission struck her like lightning, illuminating aspects of their relationship she hadn't previously understood. His careful distance, his protective rules, his obvious struggle with his own attraction to herald of it, took on new meaning in light of his confession. You hired me as bait, she said quietly. I hired you because you needed the work, and because this ranch needs someone with your particular combination of courage and intelligence. What you choose to do with the knowledge you now possess, that's entirely up to you. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were approaching the ranch house, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sky. Even at a distance, Josie could see the tension in their postures, the deliberate way they spread out as they approached. Go upstairs, Gideon said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of command. Stay there until they leave. Who are they? Trouble. The kind that's been circling this place like vultures for months. He moved to the gun cabinet in the corner, withdrawing a well-maintained Colt revolver. "Miss Lane, I need you to understand something. If you stay here, if you choose to help me fight this, there's no guarantee you'll survive. These men have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again." The riders were closer now, close enough for Josie to make out individual faces. The man in the lead wore a sheriff's badge that glinted in the sunlight, his weathered features set in an expression of false concern. Sheriff Coleman, she realized, the very man who had ruled the previous deaths as accidents. "I'm not leaving," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "My brother needs this job, needs the money I'm earning here. And those women, Sarah, Elena, Margaret, they deserve justice." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that reminded him of the soldiers he'd served with during the war. The ones who had faced impossible odds, not because they weren't afraid, but because their fear was outweighed by their commitment to something larger than themselves. "Then we fight," he said simply, "but we fight smart. Let me handle Coleman and his men. Watch from upstairs. Listen to everything they say. We'll need every piece of information we can gather if we're going to survive what's coming." As Josie made her way to the staircase, she heard the riders pull up outside, their voices carrying through the thin mountain air. Sheriff Coleman's laugh was particularly chilling, the sound of a man who believed himself untouchable. From her position at the upstairs window, she watched Gideon step onto the porch, his posture relaxed but alert. Even facing 3 armed men, he projected an aura of quiet confidence that spoke of hard-won experience in dangerous situations. "Afternoon, Cole," Sheriff Coleman called out, his tone carrying false friendliness. "Heard you got yourself another housekeeper. Pretty little thing from what folks in town are saying." "Miss Lane is an excellent employee," Gideon replied evenly. "Hard-working and reliable." "That's good to hear, real good. Course, we both know how these things tend to work out, don't we?" Coleman's smile was cold as winter steel. "Seems like you have terrible luck with housekeepers. Terrible, tragic luck." The threat was barely veiled, spoken with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. But as Josie watched from above, she noticed something the sheriff had missed: the subtle shift in Gideon's stance, the way his hand had moved almost imperceptibly closer to his holstered weapon. "Is that some kind of threat, Sheriff?" Gideon's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. "Threat? Course not, Cole. Just expressing my concern for the young lady's welfare. This is dangerous country, especially for women living alone with men who seem to attract trouble." The conversation continued for several more minutes, each exchange loaded with subtext and barely contained hostility. But it was what Josie overheard as the men prepared to leave that made her blood run cold. "Give it 2 weeks," one of Coleman's companions said in a voice he clearly thought was too low to carry. "Long enough for the girl to get comfortable, let her guard down. Then we'll arrange another one of them tragic accidents. Make sure it's messy this time," Coleman replied. "Cole needs to understand that we mean business." As the riders departed, Josie remained at the window, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd witnessed. The burned letter in Gideon's study wasn't just evidence of past threats, it was a blueprint for her own murder, planned with the casual efficiency of men who had perfected their methods through previous success. When Gideon called for her to come downstairs, she descended with a new understanding of her situation. She wasn't just a housekeeper anymore, wasn't just a woman desperate to support her sick brother. She was a target, marked for death by men who viewed her life as nothing more than a tool to be used against the man who employed her. But she was also something else, something that might just give them the edge they needed to survive. She was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The war for Blackthorn Ranch had begun, and this time, the intended victim knew it was coming. The days following Sheriff Coleman's visit passed with deceptive tranquility. On the surface, life at Blackthorn Ranch continued its familiar morning chores, afternoon repairs, evening meals shared in comfortable silence. But beneath the routine, Josie felt the constant weight of watchful eyes, the prickle of unseen danger that made every shadow suspect and every unusual sound a potential threat. Gideon had become even more protective since her discovery of the burned letter, though his methods were subtle enough that an outside observer might not notice the change. He never left the ranch now without ensuring Miguel was present and armed. He positioned himself strategically during meals, always with a clear view of the windows and doors. Most telling of all, he had begun carrying his sidearm openly, the leather holster riding low on his hip like a grim reminder of the violence that had claimed his previous employees. Miguel Santos had taken to his role as protector with the gravity of a man fulfilling a sacred duty. The elderly ranch hand's wooden rosary had become a constant presence in Josie's daily life, pressed into her hands each morning with a whispered blessing, its familiar weight, a tangible reminder of the faith and protection he offered so freely. "Señorita," Miguel said on the fourth morning after Coleman's visit, approaching her as she hung laundry on the line behind the house. His weathered fingers worked constantly at the rosary beads, a nervous habit that had intensified since the sheriff's threatening visit. "You must be very careful today. The patron, he rides to the north pasture to check the cattle. I will stay close, but..." He glanced toward the tree line that bordered the ranch's eastern boundary. "Something feels wrong. The birds, they are too quiet. Even the wind sounds different." Josie paused in her work, a damp shirt still clutched in her hands. Over the past weeks, she had learned to trust Miguel's instincts about the land and its moods. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle signs that preceded trouble, a skill honed by decades of life on the frontier. "What kind of wrong?" she asked, following his gaze toward the dense pines that climbed the mountainside. "Like the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen." He crossed himself quickly, his dark eyes troubled. "Perhaps you should stay inside today, señorita. Work on the mending, prepare the evening meal, leave the outdoor chores for tomorrow." But Josie had discovered something about herself during her time at the ranch, a stubborn streak that refused to be cowed by vague threats and ominous feelings. The work needed doing, and she had never been the type of woman to cower indoors when there was honest labor to be accomplished. "I appreciate your concern, Miguel, truly I do, but I won't let fear turn me into a prisoner in my own home." She resumed hanging the clothes, her movements deliberate and defiant. "Besides, if someone is watching the ranch, hiding inside will only convince them that their intimidation is working." Miguel's expression showed his disapproval, but also a grudging respect for her courage. "Then you will keep this close," he said, pressing the rosary firmly into her free hand. "And you will promise meet the first sign of trouble, you will call out. I will hear you, no matter where I am on the ranch." The morning progressed without incident, but Josie found herself increasingly aware of small details that might have escaped her notice in weeks past. The way the horses in the corral seemed restless, their ears constantly pricked toward the eastern woods. The unusual silence Miguel had mentioned, as if even the insects and birds sensed some approaching disturbance. Most unsettling of all, the feeling of being observed, not the casual curiosity of wildlife, but the focused attention of human eyes. It was while she was working in the vegetable garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans and squash, that she heard the first sounds of approaching riders. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace along the main trail that led to the ranch. Too many to be Gideon returning from his work, too purposeful to be casual travelers. Miguel appeared at her side with startling speed, his weathered face grim with concern. "Inside, señorita, now." "How many?" she asked, already moving toward the house. "4, maybe 5. And they're not trying to hide their approach." He guided her toward the kitchen door, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. "That worries me more than if they were sneaking around." From the kitchen window, Josie watched as the riders crested the small hill that marked the ranch's main entrance. 5 men, just as Miguel had predicted, their faces hard beneath the brims of their hats. She recognized none of them, but their postures and the casual way they carried their weapons spoke of men accustomed to violence. The leader of the group, A tall man with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes raised his hand in a gesture that might have been mistaken for a friendly greeting, if not for the predatory smile that accompanied it. "Afternoon," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "We're looking for Miss Josephine Lane. Understand she's working here now." Miguel stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the riders and the house. "The señorita is not available for visitors today. You can state your business with me, or you can ride on." The silver-haired man's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow with tobacco. "Oh, but our business is specifically with the lady. See, we've got word that her brother, young Tommy, isn't it? He's taken a turn for the worse. Doctor in town sent us to fetch her right away." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Josie caught the subtle tells that revealed its false nature. These men knew her brother's name, knew about his illness, but they spoke of him with the detached familiarity of people who had gathered information for a specific purpose rather than out of genuine concern. If Tommy were worse, Dr. Patterson would have sent word through proper channels. She called out through the window, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. He would have sent Mrs. Patterson or one of the church ladies, not strangers. The leader's expression darkened at her refusal to be drawn out. "Lady, I don't think you understand the seriousness of the situation. The boy's asking for you. Might not have much time left." It was a cruel tactic, playing on her deepest fear and strongest motivation. For a moment, Josie felt her resolve waver. What if Tommy really was worse? What if her stubborn refusal to trust these men resulted in her missing her brother's final moments? But then she remembered the threatening letter in Gideon's study, the casual way Sheriff Coleman had spoken of, arranging another tragic accident. These men weren't here to help her reach a dying brother. They were here to ensure she became the next victim in their campaign of terror. "Miguel," she said quietly, her voice barely audible, "can you get word to Mr. Cole?" "Already done, señorita. I sent young Pedro with a message the moment these men appeared on the horizon. The patron will be here soon." The standoff continued for several more minutes, the riders growing increasingly agitated as their psychological manipulation failed to achieve the desired result. Josie could see them exchanging glances, clearly debating whether to escalate to more direct methods. It was then that the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Gideon's return. He appeared at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride, his rifle already drawn and ready. The transformation in the confrontation was immediate, where moments before the 5 intruders had held the advantage of numbers and position. Gideon's arrival shifted the balance of power. "Gentlemen," Gideon said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to command, "you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you state your business quickly and then remove yourselves from my land." The silver-haired leader's confident demeanor cracked slightly in the face of Gideon's obvious readiness for violence. "Just trying to help the lady reach her sick brother Cole. No need for hostility. Miss Lane's brother is perfectly well, last I heard. Saw him playing with the other children outside the church just yesterday when I rode through town." Gideon's rifle remained trained on the group's leader, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "So either you gentlemen are misinformed, or you're here under false pretenses." The confrontation might have escalated into open violence, but the sound of additional riders approaching from the east changed the dynamic once again. 3 more men appeared, these wearing the badges of deputy sheriffs, their weapons already drawn. "Problem here, boys." The lead deputy, a thin man with nervous eyes, addressed the silver-haired intruders rather than Gideon, making his allegiances clear. "No problem at all, Deputy Morrison," the leader replied, his confidence returning now that the odds had shifted back in his favor. "Just trying to assist Miss Lane in a family emergency. Mr. Cole here seems to think he can prevent a woman from visiting her dying brother." It was masterfully done, twisting the situation to make Gideon appear as the aggressor while painting themselves as concerned citizens. Josie watched from the window as Gideon calculated the odds, his military training evident in the way he assessed the tactical situation. 8 armed men against Gideon and Miguel, Poor odds under the best of circumstances, impossible when half the opposing force wore badges and could claim legal authority for whatever violence might follow. "Miss Lane is free to leave any time she chooses," Gideon said finally, lowering his rifle slightly. "But she's also free to verify the truth of your claims before making that choice. Perhaps Deputy Morrison would be willing to ride into town and confirm the boy's condition with Dr. Patterson." The suggestion clearly wasn't what the intruders had hoped for. Deputy Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, obviously reluctant to do anything that might expose the deception. "That seems unnecessary," the silver-haired man said quickly. "The boy's condition could change while we waste time with bureaucratic nonsense. Miss Lane, surely you want to see your brother while there's still time." It was Josie who broke the deadlock, stepping onto the porch with Miguel's rosary clutched in her hands like a talisman. "If my brother is truly dying, then I'll need to collect my things and arrange for my wages to be sent to him. That will take time, perhaps an hour or two. I'm sure you gentlemen can wait that long, or return later this evening." The suggestion sent visible ripples of frustration through the group. Clearly, their plan had depended on creating a sense of urgent crisis that would force her to leave immediately, without time for preparation or second thoughts. "The boy might not have an hour or two," Deputy Morrison said, his voice lacking conviction. "Then you should ride back to town immediately and ask Dr. Patterson to do everything in his power to keep him comfortable until I can arrive." Josie replied smoothly. "I'm sure a man of your authority could convince the doctor to make special efforts." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Tommy were truly dying, the logical response would be to summon medical assistance, not to waste time arguing with his sister. By refusing to do so, the deputies and their companions revealed the falseness of their entire premise. After several more minutes of increasingly strained conversation, the group finally departed, but not before the silver-haired leader delivered a parting message that chilled Josie to the bone. "Miss Lane, I hope you won't regret choosing to trust the wrong people. This country's hard on women who make poor decisions about who to believe." As the riders disappeared over the hill, Gideon holstered his rifle and turned to study Josie's face. "That was well handled. You kept your head when a lesser person might have panicked." "They knew about Tommy," she said quietly. "Knew his name, knew about his illness. Someone's been watching us, gathering information." "Yes, which means they're more organized and better informed than I initially believed." He moved closer, his expression grave. "Miss Lane, I need you to understand something. What just happened, that was a test. They wanted to see how you'd respond to pressure, whether you could be manipulated or frightened into making mistakes. You passed their test, but that also means they'll view you as a more serious threat." Miguel nodded grimly, his fingers working constantly at his rosary beads. "They will try again, señorita. Next time they will not be so polite about it." As evening approached and the normal routines of ranch life resumed, Josie found herself reflecting on the changes that had occurred since her arrival at Blackthorn Ranch. She had come here as a woman driven by desperation, willing to accept any employment that would allow her to support her sick brother. But the woman who had faced down 8 armed men and their psychological manipulation was someone different, someone harder, more determined, and far more dangerous than the frightened schoolteacher who had first knocked on Gideon's door. The question that remained was whether that transformation would be enough to keep her alive in the escalating war for control of the ranchand, whether the growing feelings she harbored for the taciturn man who employed her would prove to be a source of strength or a fatal weakness in the battles yet to come. The morning after the confrontation with the false deputies dawned grey and heavy, with the promise of rain. Josie woke before sunrise, as had become her custom, but instead of immediately beginning her daily routines, she found herself drawn to the small window that faced east toward the town where her brother waited. Somewhere beyond those distant hills, Tommy was beginning another day, likely wondering why his sister hadn't visited in over a week, unaware that his very existence had become a weapon in someone else's war. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, her bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The kitchen was still dark, the embers in the stove banked low from the previous evening. But as she began to rekindle the fire, she became aware that she wasn't alone in the house. Soft footsteps in the main room, the careful creak of floorboards under the weight of someone trying to move quietly. "Mr. Cole?" she called softly. "In here, Miss Lane." His voice came from the study, where a single lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. She found him seated at his desk, surrounded by papers and maps, a cup of cold coffee forgotten at his elbow. He looked as if he hadn't slept, his normally neat appearance disheveled, his grey eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Have you been up all night?" she asked, moving closer to examine the documents spread across the desktop. Sleep seemed less important than understanding exactly what we're up against. He gestured to the papers before him, letters, newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps marked with X's and notations. "I've been piecing together everything I know about the men who want this land, trying to identify patterns, connections." Josie picked up one of the newspaper clippings, its edges yellow with age. The headline read, "Mysterious Fire Destroys Henderson Ranch Family Forced to Sell." The article described a suspicious blaze that had killed several cattle and destroyed the main barn, leaving the Henderson family financially devastated and unable to continue operations. "This happened 6 months ago," she observed. "2 counties over. But look at this." He handed her another clipping. "And this." A third article, then a fourth. Each described similar incidents, soon explained accidents, mysterious deaths, financial ruin, forcing longtime ranchers to sell their properties at desperate prices. "Someone's been doing this for years," Josie said, the scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. "Not just targeting you, but systematically driving out anyone who controls valuable land or water rights." "Exactly. And in each case, the properties were purchased by the same buyer, a company called Mountain Territory Development, based out of Denver. On paper, it looks like legitimate business investment. In reality, it's organized theft, backed by murder and intimidation." She set down the clippings, her hands trembling slightly with anger. "How many people have died for their greed?" "More than we'll ever know." Gideon's voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for evil. "The 3 women who worked here were just the most recent victims. But Miss Lane, there's something else you need to see." He opened the desk's bottom drawer and withdrew a small, leather-bound Booker Bible, its pages soft with handling and marked with numerous paper slips. Josie recognized it immediately as the family Bible she had carried with her from Kansas, the one precious possession she had salvaged from the fire that destroyed her childhood home. "You had this," she said, confused. "But how?" "You left it in the kitchen yesterday morning when those men came calling. In your haste to get inside, you set it on the counter and forgot it." His fingers traced the worn leather cover with surprising gentleness. "I was returning it to your room when I noticed something." He opened the Bible to a page marked with pressed wildflowers, forget-me-nots, and wild roses that Josie had collected as a child and preserved between the sacred pages. But it wasn't the flowers that caught her attention. It was the handwriting in the margins, notes written in her father's careful script. "Property deed filed with Territorial Office, September 15, 1867. She read aloud. "Water rights confirmed through Devil's Creek tributary system." She looked up at Gideon, understanding beginning to dawn. "My father's land grant, it wasn't completely destroyed in the fire. Your family's original homestead was located along Willow Creek, approximately 8 miles southeast of here. The creek itself feeds into Devil's Creek, which means your father held legal water rights that extend to this ranch." The implications hit her like a physical blow. "They killed my parents." "I believe so, yes. The prairie fire that destroyed your farm wasn't an accident, Miss Lane. It was murder, designed to eliminate a family whose legal claims might interfere with someone else's plans for territorial expansion." Josie sank into the chair across from his desk, her father's Bible clutched in her hands. The grief she had carried for months was transforming into something harder, more focused. Her parents hadn't died in a random tragedy. They had been murdered by the same people who now threatened her, and Gideon, killed for the crime of standing in the way of other men's greed. That's why they knew about Tommy, she said quietly. Why they knew so much about our situation. They've been watching us since the fire, making sure we were too poor and desperate to cause problems. And when you came to work for me, you unknowingly connected two pieces of their puzzle, the woman with legal claims to crucial water rights, and the man they've been trying to drive off his mineral-rich land. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Miguel appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Patron, señorita, you need to see this." He held up a piece of paper that had clearly been folded and unfolded many times. "I found it nailed to the barn door this morning." Gideon took the paper and read aloud, "Cole, your time is up. The woman dies tonight unless you're gone by sunrise. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The message was unsigned, but the handwriting matched that of the burned letter they had discovered days earlier. Josie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "They're escalating," she observed, moving from psychological pressure to direct threats. "Which means they're getting desperate." Gideon folded the note carefully, his expression thoughtful. Desperate enough to make mistakes, perhaps? Or desperate enough to stop playing games and resort to overwhelming force? Miguel's hand rested on the handle of his knife. "Patron, perhaps it is time to consider." "Running?" Gideon's voice carried a sharp edge. "Abandoning this land to murderers and thieves, letting them win through intimidation?" "Living," Miguel replied simply. "You and the señorita, you could take the boy and go somewhere far from here. Start over where these men cannot reach you." It was a sensible suggestion, the practical choice that would preserve their lives, even as it sacrificed everything else. But as Josie looked around the study at the maps and papers documenting years of systematic violence, at her father's Bible with its margin notes about water rights and legal claims, she felt something crystallize within her. "No," she said firmly. "I won't run from the people who killed my family. I won't let them drive us away so they can profit from our cowardice." Gideon studied her face, seeing in her expression an echo of his own stubborn determination. "Miss Lane, you need to understand what you're choosing. If we stay, if we fight, there's no guarantee we'll survive. These men have resources, connections, experience in this kind of warfare. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, use their confidence against them." She stood, her father's Bible pressed against her chest like armor. "You said they're getting desperate, making mistakes. What kind of mistakes?" "They revealed too much yesterday, showed us they have people inside the sheriff's department, demonstrated the scope of their intelligence network, and this morning's note gives us a timeline." "Tonight," Miguel said grimly, "which means they'll have to act in darkness, on terrain they don't know as well as we do." Gideon moved to the map, mounted behind his desk, pointing to various marked locations. "The ranch has natural defensive advantages, high ground, limited approaches, good sight lines. If we're smart about it, we can turn their attack into a trap." The next several hours passed in careful preparation. Gideon retrieved additional weapons from a hidden cache beneath the floorboards, rifles, ammunition, even a few carefully maintained military explosives left over from his service days. Miguel worked to secure the livestock and prepare defensive positions around the ranch house, and Josie, despite Gideon's initial protests, insisted on learning to handle a rifle properly. "I'm not going to cower in a corner while you and Miguel fight for our lives," she declared, accepting the weapon he reluctantly offered. "If these men want to kill me, they'll find I'm not as helpless as their previous victims." As afternoon faded toward evening, they gathered in the kitchen to share what might be their final meal together. The conversation was subdued, but not morbid, each of them drawing strength from the other's presence, finding courage in their shared commitment to stand and fight rather than flee. It was during this quiet interlude that Gideon made a confession that changed everything between them. "Miss Lane," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "if we don't survive what's coming, there are things I need you to know. Things I should have told you weeks ago." She set down her coffee cup, giving him her full attention. "The first day you arrived here, when I gave you that warning about the women who had died, I wasn't just trying to frighten you away. I was trying to protect you from something I was already falling into." "What do you mean?" "I mean that from the moment you stepped onto that porch, with your threadbare shawl and your stubborn pride, I knew you were going to be dangerous to my peace of mind. You reminded me of everything I'd given up when I came to this mountain hope, connection, the possibility that a man could find something worth fighting for, beyond mere survival." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Josie felt her heart hammering against her ribs, partly from fear of the approaching battle, but partly from something else entirely. "Mr. Cole." "Gideon," he corrected gently. "If we're going to die tonight, I'd like to hear you say my name at least once." "Gideon." The name felt strange on her lips, intimate in a way that their careful formality had never allowed. "Are you telling me that I've fallen in love with you?" "Yes, completely, irrevocably, and against every instinct for self-preservation I possess." His grey eyes met hers directly. "I hired you knowing it might get you killed. I've kept you here knowing that my feelings for you make you an even more valuable target for our enemies. I've been selfish and reckless, and—" She silenced him by reaching across the table to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. "And I've fallen in love with you too, you stubborn, protective, impossible man." The kiss that followed was inevitable, born of weeks of careful distance and growing attraction, seasoned with the desperate intensity of people who might not live to see another dawn. When they finally broke apart, Miguel was diplomatically examining his coffee cup, though Josie caught the small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well," Gideon said softly, his forehead resting against hers, "at least now I know what I'm fighting for." "We," she corrected, "what we're fighting for." As darkness fell over Blackthorn Ranch, they took their positions and waited. The silence was complete, broken only by the distant call of night birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. But all three defenders knew that somewhere in that darkness, armed men were moving into position, preparing to end the standoff with violence. The attack, when it came, would test everything they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the kind of love that refuses to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The night attack never came. Instead, dawn brought a different kind of assault tone that proved far more insidious than bullets and fire. Josie woke to the sound of hammering coming from the direction of the main road, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains with deliberate persistence. From her bedroom window, she could see men working at the entrance to the ranch, their movements purposeful and official. As she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, she found Gideon and Miguel already in the kitchen, their faces grim with a new understanding of their enemy's capabilities. "What are they doing?" she asked, accepting the cup of coffee Miguel handed her. "Building a fence," Gideon replied, his voice flat with suppressed anger. "Blocking access to the main road. They've got papers official-looking documents that claim the county has condemned this section of road for public safety reasons." "Can they do that?" "They can if they have the right connections in the territorial government, and it appears they do." He gestured toward the window, where more men were visible working along the fence line. "It's a clever strategy. Instead of attacking us directly and risking exposure, they're isolating us, making it impossible for us to leave or for anyone to reach us." Miguel set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from rage. "It is like building a cage around us, señorita. They mean to starve us out, or force us to try breaking through their barriers where they can claim we attacked them first." The full implications became clear as the morning progressed. The road crews worked with military precision, erecting not just a simple fence, but a substantial barrier topped with barbed wire. Guard posts appeared at strategic intervals, manned by men wearing deputy badges, but carrying the weapons and bearing of professional gunfighters. But it was the arrival of an official-looking carriage just before noon that delivered the most devastating blow. Sheriff Coleman himself emerged from the vehicle, accompanied by a thin man in a city suit who carried a leather portfolio stuffed with legal documents. "Cole!" Coleman called out from beyond the fence line. "Need to have a word with you. Official business." Gideon walked out to meet them, his rifle cradled casually in his arms close enough to talk, far enough to avoid any sudden moves. Josie and Miguel watched from the porch, straining to hear the conversation that would determine their fate. "This here is Mr. Harrison from the Territorial Land Office," Coleman announced, gesturing to the thin man. "Seems there's been some irregularities discovered in your original land grant, questions about the legal validity of your claim to this property." Harrison stepped forward, unfolding a yellow document from his portfolio. "Mr. Cole, I'm afraid there's been a significant administrative error discovered in the processing of your homestead application. The survey markers were improperly placed, which means your ranch buildings are actually located on federal land designated for mineral development. It was a masterful lie, delivered with the authority of official bureaucracy." Gideon studied the document Harrison held up, noting the careful forgeries and backdated stamps that would make it difficult to challenge in any legitimate court. "That's interesting," Gideon replied calmly, "considering that I personally supervised the original survey and have the surveyor's original notes in my files, along with correspondence from the territorial governor confirming the validity of my claim." Harrison's expression didn't change, but Josie caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Gideon's response wasn't entirely expected. "I'm afraid, Mr. Cole, that certain documents can be misplaced during the administrative process. What matters now is resolving this situation in a way that minimizes disruption for everyone involved. And I suppose you have a solution in mind. Mountain Territory Development has authorized me to offer compensation for any improvements you've made to the property. Fair market value, paid immediately upon your vacating the premises. And if I refuse?" Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. "Then we'll be forced to evict you as squatters on federal land. Could get messy, Cole, especially with innocent folks caught in the middle." The threat was clear, and all three men knew it. Josie felt her heart hammering as she watched Gideon weigh his options, calculating odds that seemed to grow worse with each passing moment. "I'll need time to review these documents," Gideon said finally. "Consult with legal counsel, verify the claims." 24 hours, Harrison replied. "After that, we'll be forced to proceed with immediate eviction proceedings." As the officials departed, leaving behind their guards and their illegal fence, Josie joined Gideon in his study to examine the deed they had tried to serve. The document was a work of art in terms of criminal forgery-aged paper, authentic-looking seals, even the correct legal terminology. But Gideon's trained eye caught the subtle inconsistencies that revealed its fraudulent nature. "The original survey was conducted in October," he explained, pointing to a date on the forged document. "But this shows completion in July of the same year. And the surveyor's signature, it's close, but not quite right. The real James Morton always signed with a distinctive flourish on the final, and that's missing here. So we can prove it's fake? To anyone willing to listen, yes, but that's the beauty of their strategy. They don't need the forgery to hold up in court indefinitely. They just need it to provide legal cover for whatever they do to us in the next 24 hours. The afternoon brought additional disturbing developments. Miguel discovered that their water supply had been tampered with, not poisoned, but contaminated enough to make it unsafe for drinking. The fence around the property had been extended to completely encircle the ranch, transforming it from a home into a prison. Most ominously, Josie spotted smoke rising from the direction of town-thin columns that seemed to come from the area where the church and minister's house were located. The same minister's house where her brother Tommy was staying. "They're sending a message," Gideon said grimly when she pointed out the smoke, "reminding us that they can reach anyone we care about, anywhere they might be." It was then that Josie made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through her father's Bible for any additional documentation that might support their legal position, her fingers found something unexpected, a loose page tucked between the back cover and the binding. Not a page from the Bible itself, but a letter written in her father's careful handwriting. My dearest Josephine, she read aloud, her voice catching on the familiar words. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found yourself in greater danger than I ever intended. The land grant I received from the territorial government was not the reward for honest homesteading that I pretended. It was payment for services rendered during the war services. I pray you will never need to understand. Gideon moved closer, reading over her shoulder as she continued. I was what they called a reconnaissance specialist, tasked with gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. The skills I learned, the contacts I made, the debts owed and obligations incurred, all of these have value that extends far beyond any one man's life. In the false bottom of the family trunk, you will find documents that explain everything. Use them wisely, my daughter. Trust no one in uniform, and remember that sometimes the only way to find justice is to become strong enough to take it for yourself. The letter was signed with her father's name and dated just weeks before the fire that had killed him and her mother. He knew, Josie whispered. He knew they were coming for us. And he left you the tools to fight back. Gideon's voice carried a note of respect for a man he had never met. Miss Lane Josiedo, you know where this family trunk might be now. Tommy would have it. It was the only piece of furniture we managed to save from the fire. The minister's family has been storing it in their attic. They looked at each other, both understanding the implications. The evidence they needed to expose the conspiracy and reclaim their legal rights was sitting in a trunk 12 miles away, in a town now partly on fire, guarded by enemies who would kill them both, rather than let them reach it. We have to try, Josie said simply. They'll be expecting us to make a move like that. The fence, the guards, the isolation, it's all designed to force us into a desperate breakout attempt where they can kill us and claim self-defense. Then we don't break out, she replied, a plan beginning to form in her mind. We make them come to us, and when they do, we give them exactly what they expect, right, up until the moment we don't. As evening approached, Josie stood at her bedroom window, watching the guards at their posts, studying the patterns of their patrols. Somewhere beyond those hills, her brother waited in a town that might or might not be burning. In the study below, crucial evidence lay scattered across Gideon's desk, fragments of a puzzle that, when properly assembled, could destroy the conspiracy that had killed her parents and threatened everything she had come to love about her new life. The game was approaching its endgame, and tomorrow would bring a reckoning that had been building since the first threatening letter arrived at Blackthorn Ranch. But tonight, for perhaps the last time, she allowed herself to hope that love and courage might prove stronger than greed and violence, and that the woman who had arrived at this ranch as a frightened refugee might yet become the instrument of justice her parents had never lived to see. The sound that woke Josie before dawn wasn't the usual chorus of birdsong, but something far more ominous, the measured tramp of many boots moving in formation toward the ranch house. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her fingers working by touch alone to avoid creating any light that might give away her position at the window. From her second-story vantage point, she could see them clearly now, at least 20 men arranged in a loose semicircle around the house, their weapons glinting in the pre-dawn starlight. These weren't the rough intimidators who had visited previously. These moved with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers, men who knew their business and went about it with deadly efficiency. She made her way downstairs, finding Gideon and Miguel already positioned at strategic windows, their faces grim but determined in the lamplight. "How many?" she whispered, taking her place at the kitchen window with the rifle Gideon had taught her to use. "More than we planned for," Gideon replied quietly. "They've brought serious firepower this time. Military-grade weapons, coordinated positions. Someone's decided to end this permanently." Miguel crossed himself quickly, his weathered hands steady despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "Patron, there is something you should know. During the night, while I was checking the animals, I found this hidden beneath the porch." He produced a small object wrapped in oiled clother military metal, its bronze surface tarnished, but still bearing the distinctive markings of a cavalry unit. Gideon took it with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing it as his own service decoration, the one he had hidden away years ago when he tried to leave his warrior past behind. "How did this get here?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Someone placed it there deliberately," Josie observed. "Someone who knew exactly what it would mean to you, and when you would need to remember who you used to be." The medal seemed to transform something in Gideon's bearing. The careful, controlled rancher began to fade, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. The cavalry officer who had survived some of the war's bloodiest battles through a combination of tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness when cornered. "Miss Lane," he said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of military command, "I need you to understand something about what's going to happen here. These men aren't interested in taking prisoners or negotiating surrenders. They mean to kill all three of us and burn the ranch house to cover the evidence. Then we make sure they pay dearly for the privilege," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The attack began just as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern peaks. Not with the chaotic rush of amateur thugs, but with the methodical advance of trained fighters who understood the value of coordinated fire and overlapping fields of attack. Windows shattered under the impact of carefully aimed shots, forcing the defenders to take cover behind overturned furniture and interior walls. But Gideon's military experience proved its worth in those crucial first minutes. He had positioned them not just to defend the house, but to control the approaches and create killing fields that turned the attackers' superior numbers into a disadvantage. Miguel, despite his age, proved to be a crack shot with the old Springfield rifle he had carried since his days fighting in Mexico. And Josie discovered that the school teacher's precision that had once served her in correcting arithmetic problems translated remarkably well to rifle work. Her shots might not have the devastating impact of Gideon's military marksmanship, but they were accurate enough to keep the attackers honest, to make them think twice before exposing themselves to her line of fire. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably no more than 20 minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, 5 of the attackers lay motionless in the ranch yard, and several others were dragging themselves away with wounds that would keep them out of any future fights. But the victory came at a cost. Miguel had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and both Gideon and Josie bore minor wounds from flying splinters and ricocheting shots. More critically, the house itself was badly damaged, with several walls showing the kind of structural damage that would make it uninhabitable until major repairs could be completed. "This was just the opening move," Gideon said as they surveyed the damage. "They wanted to test our defenses, see how we'd respond to a direct assault. Now they know what they're dealing with. They'll adapt their tactics accordingly." Indeed, the next phase of the siege proved even more insidious than open warfare. Instead of another frontal assault, their enemies began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to break their spirits and force them into making desperate mistakes. The first element was isolation. The fence around the property was reinforced with additional guards, making any attempt to break out tantamount to suicide. But more cruel was the systematic destruction of everything that made the ranch a working, living place. Cattle were driven off or shot, crops were trampled, the barn was set ablaze in the middle of the night. Then came the personal attacks. Messages were delivered by arrow, shot over the fence to land in the ranch yard where they couldn't be ignored. Some contained news of other ranchers who had been convinced to sell their properties to mountain territory development. Others brought updates on the situation in town, including detailed descriptions of the house where Tommy was staying, complete with sketches showing how easily it could be burned with everyone inside. But it was the arrival of a familiar face that delivered the most devastating blow to their morale. Dr. Patterson himself appeared at the fence line on the third morning after the battle, his medical bag in hand and his usually kind face marked by obvious distress. "Gideon," he called out, "I need to speak with Miss Lane. It's about her brother." Despite every instinct warning her against trusting anyone who approached under such circumstances, Josie found herself walking toward the fence. Tommy was the one person in the world she would risk everything to protect, and if he was truly in danger, she had to know. "Dr. Patterson," she said, stopping just out of reach of the guards who flanked him. "Is Tommy all right?" The doctor's expression was anguished. "Miss Lane, I'm afraid the boy has taken a turn for the worse. His breathing difficulties have worsened significantly, and without proper medical attention." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air between them. "What kind of medical attention?" Gideon asked, moving up beside Josie. "There's a specialist in Denver, Dr. Morrison at the Territorial Hospital. He's had remarkable success treating lung conditions like Tommy's, but the boy would need to be transported there immediately. The journey alone, in his current condition, could be fatal without proper preparation and accompaniment." It was perfectly crafted psychological manipulation, playing on Josie's deepest fears and strongest motivations. But there were details that didn't quite ring true, small inconsistencies that suggested the doctor was either lying outright or being coerced into delivering someone else's message. "Dr. Patterson," Josie said carefully, "when I saw Tommy 3 weeks ago, his breathing was actually improving. The mountain air seemed to be helping. Are you telling me he's gotten significantly worse in that short time?" The doctor's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly toward one of the guards before returning to her face. "Lung conditions can be unpredictable, Miss Lane, especially in children. Sometimes what appears to be improvement is actually the calm before a more serious crisis." "And this Dr. Morrison in Denver, you've worked with him before?" Another slight hesitation. "By reputation, yes. He's well regarded in his field." Gideon stepped closer to the fence, his experienced eye taking in the subtle signs of coercion, the way the doctor held himself, the careful positioning of the guards, the slight tremor in his voice that suggested fear rather than medical concern. "Doctor," Gideon said quietly, "I fought in the war. I know what a man looks like when he's being forced to say things he doesn't want to say. Is Tommy actually sick? Or are you here because someone is threatening you?" Dr. Patterson's composure cracked slightly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the deception he'd been forced to participate in. "The boy is fine," he admitted quietly. "He's been asking about his sister, wondering why she hasn't visited, but his health has been stable." One of the guards stepped forward menacingly, but the doctor continued speaking in a rush of conscience-driven honesty. "They have my daughter, Miss Lane. My Sarathe took her from the schoolhouse yesterday and said they'd kill her if I didn't convince you to leave the ranch. I'm sorry, I'm so terribly sorry, but I couldn't let them hurt my child." The revelation hit Josie like a physical blow. Not only was her brother being used as a weapon against her, but now innocent children were being kidnapped to coerce their parents into participating in the conspiracy. The scope of evil they were fighting seemed to expand with each new discovery. "Where is she?" Gideon demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "I don't know. They blindfolded me when they brought me here, and they never told me where they're keeping her. All I know is that if you don't surrender by sunset today, they'll—" His voice broke, unable to finish the terrible sentence. As Dr. Patterson was led away by his captors, Josie felt the walls of their trap closing in around them. It was no longer just about defending the ranch or exposing the conspiracy. Now innocent children were being used as pawns in a game that seemed designed to force them into impossible choices. "We have to do something," she said, turning to Gideon with desperation in her eyes. "We will," he replied, his voice carrying the cold determination of a man who had finally been pushed beyond his breaking point. "But not what they expect. Not surrender. Not a desperate breakout attempt, not a last stand that ends with all of us dead." He looked down at the military medal in his palm, then closed his fingers around it like a talisman. "Miss Lane, I need you to trust me one more time. What I'm about to propose will be dangerous, and there's no guarantee it will work. But if we can pull it off, we might just turn this whole situation around and give these bastards exactly what they deserve." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the besieged ranch, Josie found herself facing the same choice that had brought her here in the first place: trust a man who seemed to attract danger, or find herself destroyed by forces beyond her control. But this time, the stakes weren't just her own survival or her brother's welfare. This time, the future of everyone she had come to care about hung in the balance, And the woman who had once been too frightened to make any choice at all now found herself ready to risk everything on the slim hope that courage and love might yet triumph over greed and cruelty. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or careful investigation, but through a simple mistake made by a man who believed himself untouchable. Sheriff Coleman arrived at the fence line just after noon, his badge catching the harsh sunlight as he surveyed the battle-damaged ranch with obvious satisfaction. But it wasn't his presence that caught Josie's attention, it was what he carried in his hand. A sheriff's badge, identical to his own, its silver surface gleaming as if recently polished. "Cole," Coleman called out with false joviality. "Time to end this foolishness. We've got legal papers here that transfer ownership of this property to its rightful claimants. You can walk away with compensation, or we can drag your bodies out. Your choice." But Josie was no longer listening to his words. Instead, she was staring at that second badge, recognition dawning like ice water in her veins. She had seen it before, pinned to the vest of the silver-haired man who had tried to lure her away with false news of her brother's illness. The same man who had spoken with casual confidence about arranging tragic accidents for women who asked too many questions. "That badge," she whispered to Gideon, who was positioned beside her at the kitchen window. "Sheriff Coleman has a second badge. Why would he need two unless he's been impersonating multiple law enforcement officers?" Gideon finished, understanding immediately, which means he's not just Carruthers, the one coordinating everything. The implications cascaded through Josie's mind with terrible clarity. If Coleman was running the entire operation, then he had access to official records, legal documents, territorial communications. He could forge papers, manipulate investigations, and make people disappear with the full authority of his office as cover. "He killed them," she said, her voice barely audible. "Sarah, Elena, Margarethi killed them himself, then conducted the investigations that ruled their deaths accidental." As if summoned by their revelation, Miguel appeared at the back door, his wounded shoulder bound with clean cloth, but his dark eyes burning with urgent purpose. "Patron, señorita, you must come quickly. I found something in the barn, something that changes everything." Despite the danger of exposing themselves to sniper fire, they followed Miguel through the damaged structure to a corner where feed sacks had been stacked against the wall. Behind the sacks, hidden in a space that would have been invisible to casual inspection, was a collection of items that made Josie's breath catch in her throat. 3 sets of women's personal belongings, carefully preserved and labeled with dates. Sarah Mitchell's locket, the real one, not the replica Gideon had been carrying. Elena Vasquez's rosary beads, their wooden surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Margaret O'Brien's wedding ring, the gold band she had worn even after her husband's death in a mining accident. But it was the 4th collection that stopped Josie's heart entirely. Her own belongings, from the farm in Kansas, a sampler she had embroidered as a child, her mother's pearl hair combs, her father's pipe. Items that should have been destroyed in the fire that killed her family, now arranged with the same careful preservation as the murdered women's effects. "He's been planning this for years," Gideon said grimly, examining the macabre collection. "Not just the attacks on the ranch, but everything. The fire that killed your family, the systematic intimidation of other ranchers, it's all been leading to this moment." Miguel nodded, his weathered face creased with anger. "There is more, Patron, hidden beneath the floor maps, documents, correspondence. This Sheriff Coleman, he is not working alone. This conspiracy, it reaches much higher than we imagined." The cache beneath the barn's floorboards revealed the true scope of what they faced. Letters bearing the seals of territorial officials, mining company executives, even federal bureaucrats in Washington. Financial records showing the transfer of enormous sums of money, and most damning of all, a detailed plan for the systematic acquisition of mineral-rich properties throughout the entire territory. "It's not just about this ranch," Josie realized, studying a map marked with dozens of targeted properties. They're planning to control the entire region's mineral wealth. Water rights, gold deposits, silver veins, everything. And anyone who stands in their way gets eliminated, Gideon added, pointing to a list of names that included her father's. Some through financial pressure, others through accidents, and a few through outright murder when subtlety fails. But it was the final document in the cache that provided the key to everything, a letter dated just weeks earlier, bearing the letterhead of Mountain Territory Development, and signed by someone whose name sent chills through both Josie and Gideon. Governor Morrison, Josie read aloud. The territorial governor himself is involved in this conspiracy. The letter outlined the final phase of the operation, the elimination of Gideon Cole and anyone associated with him, followed by the immediate transfer of Blackthorn Ranch to federal control for strategic mineral development. It was signed with the governor's own hand and countersigned by Sheriff Coleman, making their partnership explicit and undeniable. This is why they've been so confident, Gideon said, his voice tight with controlled fury. They have protection at the highest levels of territorial government. Even if we expose Coleman, even if we prove the conspiracy exists, they have enough political influence to ensure nothing comes of it. Unless we make it impossible for them to cover it up, Josie replied, an idea beginning to form in her mind. These documents, they're evidence of federal crimes. Conspiracy, murder, fraud, on a territorial scale, the kind of crimes that would demand investigation from Washington itself, not just local authorities. Miguel crossed himself as he often did when contemplating the complexities of American politics. But, Señorita, how do we get these papers to Washington when we are trapped here like animals in a cage? We don't take them to Washington, Josie said, her voice gaining strength as the plan crystallized. We make Washington come to us. As afternoon wore on toward evening, they refined their desperate strategy. The documents they had discovered weren't just evidence, they were weapons that could destroy the conspiracy if used correctly. But deploying those weapons would require them to abandon the defensive position that had kept them alive so far and venture into the heart of enemy territory. It's suicide, Gideon said bluntly when Josie outlined her plan. You're talking about walking into town, confronting Coleman on his own ground, surrounded by his people and his resources. I'm talking about ending this war instead of just surviving another battle, she replied. Those documents prove that federal crimes have been committed, but they're useless if we just hide here with them until Coleman's people overwhelm our defenses. And if you're wrong, if we can't get the evidence to the right people before they kill us all. Josie looked around the damaged barn, seeing in the hidden cache of personal belongings a monument to all the people who had already died for other men's greed. Sarah, Elena, Margaret, her own parents, all of them, had trusted in law and order, had believed that justice would prevail if they just followed the rules and waited for help to arrive. All of them were dead. Then at least we'll die fighting instead of cowering, she said simply, and maybe, just maybe, we'll take enough of them with us that the next family won't have to face what we've faced. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the besieged ranch, they made their final preparations. The evidence was carefully packaged and hidden in multiple locations, some with Miguel, who would remain to defend the ranch, others with Josie and Gideon for their dangerous journey into town. But it was the discovery of one final item in Coleman's cache that gave them the weapon they needed to turn the tables completely. A telegraph key, obviously stolen from the town's communication office, along with copies of every message that had been sent to or received from territorial and federal authorities over the past 6 months. Among those messages was one that changed everything. A communication from a federal marshal named Thomas Wade, informing Governor Morrison that he was conducting an investigation into reports of illegal land seizures and suspicious deaths in the territory. The governor's response had been to assure Marshal Wade that local authorities had found no evidence of wrongdoing and that his intervention was unnecessary. But the marshal's original message included details that only someone with federal authority and investigative resources could have discovered. Details about the conspiracy that matched exactly what Josie and Gideon had uncovered through their own desperate research. He's still investigating, Josie realized. This Marshal Wade, he knows something is wrong here, even if the governor has been trying to convince him otherwise. Which means, if we can get word to him, provide him with the evidence we've found, we can bring down the entire conspiracy, from Coleman all the way up to Governor Morrison himself. As night fell over Blackthorn Ranch, Josie and Gideon made their final preparations for what might be their last desperate gamble. The telegraph key represented their only hope of reaching Marshal Wade before Coleman's forces overwhelmed their defenses, but using it would require them to reach the town's telegraph office, a building that was certainly under Coleman's control. "There's another way," Miguel said quietly as they studied the stolen telegraph equipment. "My nephew Carlos. He works for the railroad company in Cedar Falls, 2 days' ride south. They have their own telegraph lines, independent of the territorial system." "Can he be trusted?" Gideon asked. "With his life, patron, and more importantly, with yours. Carlos fought beside me in Mexico, understands about corrupt officials and the need to find justice outside official channels." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. While Gideon created a diversion by attempting to break through the fence on the ranch's eastern border, Josie would slip out through a hidden passage Miguel had discovered in the barn's foundation, a tunnel that led to the creek bed and could get her past the perimeter guards unseen. From there, she would make her way to Cedar Falls, carrying copies of the most damning evidence, while Gideon drew Coleman's attention and resources away from her escape route. It was a plan that required split-second timing, absolute trust, and a degree of luck they had no right to expect. "If something goes wrong," Gideon said as they prepared to part, "if I don't make it out of this—" "You will," Josie interrupted firmly. "We both will. And when this is over, when Coleman and his people are in federal custody, we're going to build a life together that's worth all the risk we're taking tonight." They kissed then, with the desperate intensity of people who might never see each other again, tasting the salt of tears and the metallic edge of fear. When they separated, both knew that whatever happened in the hours to come would determine not just their survival, but the future of everyone they had come to love and protect. The diversion began at midnight with the sound of explosions from the ranch's eastern boundary. Gideon's military experience had taught him how to make a small amount of dynamite sound like a major assault, and the guards responded exactly as predicted, rushing toward the apparent breakout attempt and leaving the western approaches lightly defended. Josie slipped through Miguel's tunnel like a ghost, emerging into the creek bed just as shouting and gunfire erupted from the opposite side of the ranch. The water was icy against her boots, but she welcomed the cold as a reminder that she was still alive, still fighting, still capable of making the choices that would determine her fate. The journey to Cedar Falls took her through country she had never seen, following game trails and creek beds that kept her hidden from the main roads where Coleman's men might be patrolling. By dawn, she was miles from the ranch, carrying in her saddlebags the evidence that could destroy a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. But it was only when she saw the smoke rising from the direction of Blackthorn Ranch that she realized the true cost of their gamble. Black smoke, thick and oily, the kind that came from burning buildings rather than grass fires or forest blazes. Coleman had escalated beyond intimidation and siege warfare. He was burning them out, destroying everything rather than risk the evidence they possessed falling into federal hands. As Josie urged her horse toward the distant railroad town, she carried with her not just documents and testimony, but the weight of everyone who had died for this moment and the terrible uncertainty of whether the man she loved would survive long enough to see justice finally served. The telegram that reached Federal Marshal Thomas Wade in Denver was unlike any communication he had received in 20 years of law enforcement. Written with the precision of someone who understood that every word might mean the difference between justice and catastrophe, it contained enough specific details about territorial corruption to make him abandon his current investigation and ride immediately for the Mountain Territory. But the message that truly galvanized him into action was the final line, written in a woman's careful script. By the time you read this, the evidence may be destroyed and the witnesses dead. If you want justice for murdered federal land grant holders, come armed and come quickly. Josie had reached Cedar Falls just as Coleman's assault on Blackthorn Ranch was reaching its crescendo. The smoke she had seen from miles away proved to be not just the ranch house burning, but a systematic destruction of everything that might contain evidence of the conspiracy. Miguel's nephew Carlos had transmitted her message to Marshal Wade within hours, but whether help would arrive in time remained an agonizing uncertainty. Now, 3 days later, she found herself riding back toward the Devil's Backbone Range in the company of 12 federal marshals, their badges hidden beneath travel coats, but their weapons very much in evidence. Marshal Wade himself was a man carved from the same hard stone as the mountains they approached, weathered by years of frontier justice, his grey eyes holding the kind of patient ruthlessness that came from hunting the worst kinds of criminals across impossible terrain. "Miss Lane," Wade said as they paused to rest their horses at a creek crossing, "I need you to understand something about what we're riding into. If half of what you've told me is true, then we're facing not just local corruption, but organized resistance from people who have everything to lose and the resources to fight back." "Marshal, I've been facing that for weeks now. The question isn't whether they'll fight, it's whether there's anything left worth fighting for." The smoke that had driven her from the ranch 3 days earlier had been visible for miles, and no word had reached them about survivors. For all she knew, Gideon and Miguel were dead, their bodies burned beyond recognition in the systematic destruction Coleman had unleashed. "There's always something worth fighting for," Wade replied quietly. "Sometimes it's just the principle that good people shouldn't die unavenged." As they crested the final ridge before Blackthorn Ranch, the scope of the destruction became clear. The main house was a blackened ruin, its stone chimney standing like a tombstone among the ashes. The barn had been reduced to charred timbers, and even the fences had been torn down and burned. But it was what they didn't see that gave Josie the first flicker of hope she had felt in days. No bodies lying in the yard, no buzzards circling overhead. And most tellingly, no signs of the systematic search that would have followed if Coleman's people had found and eliminated everyone on the ranch. "They got away," she whispered, her voice catching with emotion. "Maybe," Wade cautioned, "or maybe they're in hiding, waiting to see who comes calling. Either way, we proceed carefully." The approach to the ranch was a masterclass in tactical awareness. Wade's marshals spread out in a formation that covered all approaches, while remaining ready to respond to threats from any direction. But it was Josie who spotted the signal that told her Gideon was not only alive, but watching their approach. A single white cloth tied to a fence post that had survived the burning positioned exactly where Gideon had told her he would place a message if he ever needed to communicate with her from a distance. The cloth itself looked like random debris from the fire, but its placement was too deliberate to be accidental. "He's here," she said with certainty. "Gideon's alive, and he's been watching us since we came over the ridge." Wade studied the landscape with the practiced eye of a man who had survived countless ambushes. "Where?" "The rock outcropping north of the house. It's the only position that gives a clear view of all approaches while remaining hidden from ground level." She pointed to a jumble of boulders that looked natural but would provide perfect cover for an experienced marksman. "Mr. Cole," Wade called out, his voice carrying easily across the burned landscape. "Federal Marshal Thomas Wade. Miss Lane is with me, along with 11 other federal officers. We're here to investigate the territorial conspiracy," she reported. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the rock-snot Gideon. But Miguel, his wounded shoulder still bound, but his rifle held with steady hands. "Señorita," Miguel called out, his weathered face breaking into a smile that was visible even at a distance. "The patron, he said you would return with help, but I did not dare believe it until I saw you with my own eyes." The reunion that followed was subdued by the magnitude of what they had all lost, but profound in its relief. Gideon emerged from his hiding place looking like a man who had aged years in the space of days. His clothes were singed, his hands bore fresh burns from fighting the fires Coleman's people had set, and his eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who had fought impossible odds and somehow survived. But when he saw Josie riding toward him alive and unharmed, something in his expression transformed. The careful control he had maintained throughout their ordeal cracked, revealing the depth of emotion he had been carrying. "I thought they had killed you," he said simply as she dismounted and ran into his arms. "When the telegraph office in town was destroyed the same night you left, I was certain they had caught you before you could get word out." "They tried," she replied, holding him tight enough to convince herself he was real. "But your distraction worked perfectly. By the time they realized I was gone, I was already miles away." Marshal Wade watched the reunion with the patient interest of a man gathering intelligence. When the immediate emotions had settled, he began the methodical process of documenting everything they had discovered about the conspiracy. The evidence that had survived Coleman's systematic destruction was overwhelming. The documents hidden in multiple locations, the testimony of 3 eyewitnesses, the physical evidence of arson and attempted murder of it, painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond anything Wade had initially suspected. But it was Gideon's military experience that provided the tactical insight they needed to turn evidence into justice. "Coleman made a critical mistake when he burned the ranch," Gideon explained, as they studied maps of the surrounding territory. "He committed acts of obvious violence that can't be explained away as accidents or legal proceedings. Up until now, he's been careful to maintain plausible deniability. But arson, attempted murder of federal witnesses, those are crimes that demand federal intervention, regardless of local political connections." "Which means he's desperate," Wade observed. "Desperate enough to abandon subtlety and rely on overwhelming force to eliminate anyone who can testify against him." "Exactly. And desperate men make mistakes that tactical men can exploit." The plan they developed over the next several hours was audacious in its scope and breathtaking in its complexity. Instead of simply gathering evidence and hoping for prosecution through normal channels, they would use Coleman's own desperation against him, forcing him into a confrontation where his crimes would be witnessed by federal officers and documented beyond any possibility of cover-up. The key was the Winchester rifle that had been Gideon's constant companion throughout the siege, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. Coleman knew that rifle, knew its distinctive markings and the skill of the man who carried it. If Gideon appeared to be moving alone and vulnerable, Coleman's arrogance and desire for personal revenge might override his tactical caution. "You're talking about using yourself as bait," Josie said when she understood the full scope of what Gideon was proposing. "I'm talking about ending this war on terms that favor justice instead of corruption," he replied. "Coleman has been hunting me for months, blaming me for his inability to simply take what he wants through intimidation. If I give him the chance for a final confrontation, his ego won't let him resist. And if you're wrong, if he's learned enough caution to avoid obvious traps." Gideon looked around the burned ruins of his ranch, seeing in the destruction not just personal loss, but a symbol of everything the conspiracy had taken from innocent people throughout the territory. "Then we'll have given him the chance to prove he's smarter than his victims gave him credit for. But either way, this ends tomorrow. One way or another, the people responsible for Sarah's death, Elena's death, Margaret's death, your parents' deaths, they answer for what they've done." As night fell over the destroyed ranch, federal marshals took positions in concealment throughout the area. Josie found herself assigned to a role that made her stomach clench with anxiety. She would be positioned with Wade and 2 other marshals at the most likely point of Coleman's approach. Close enough to witness whatever happened, but hopefully far enough away to avoid becoming a casualty. But it was in the quiet hour before dawn, as they made their final preparations, that Gideon made a confession that changed everything about her understanding of their situation. "There's something I need you to know," he said as he checked the loading of his rifle one final time. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but didn't have the courage to face." "What is it?" "The first woman who died here, Sarah Mitchell, she wasn't just my housekeeper. She was the woman I had planned to marry." The revelation hit Josie like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything she thought she understood about Gideon's motivations and the guilt he carried. She came here the same way you did, he continued, his voice heavy with old pain. Desperate, nowhere else to turn, willing to risk a cursed ranch for the chance to build a life. I fell in love with her courage, her determination to survive whatever this place threw at her. And when she died, when Coleman killed her, I swore I would never again put a woman I cared about in that kind of danger. But you hired me anyway, because I was tired of running from the guilt, tired of letting Coleman win through my cowardice, and because from the moment you stepped onto that porch, I could see that you were stronger than Sarah had been. Strong enough to survive what killed her, strong enough to help me fight back instead of just becoming another victim. As dawn approached and the final confrontation drew near, Josie understood that she was fighting not just for their survival or even for justice, but for the right to build a future free from the ghosts of the past. The woman who had died here before her hadn't failed. She had simply faced impossible odds without the resources and allies that made victory possible. But now, with federal marshals in position and evidence that could destroy the conspiracy documented beyond any possibility of suppression, the odds had finally shifted in favor of the innocent. The question that remained was whether courage and justice would prove stronger than corruption and greed, and whether the love that had grown between them in the shadow of death would survive to see the sunrise. The iron bell that had once called ranch hands to meals now served a different purpose as the morning mist began to lift from the Devil's Backbone Range. Gideon stood beside its weathered frame, his Winchester rifle cradled in his arms, waiting for the confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would claim the final victory. He didn't have to wait long. Sheriff Coleman appeared on the ridge just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, but he wasn't alone. At least 20 men rode with him, some wearing deputy badges, others clearly hired guns, all of them armed for war rather than law enforcement. They approached with the confidence of people who had never faced serious resistance, never imagined that their systematic campaign of terror might finally have consequences. Coleman's voice carried easily across the burned landscape, amplified by the mountain acoustics and his own arrogance. Time to finish what we started. You've caused enough trouble for civilized folks trying to make an honest living. Gideon stepped away from the bell, positioning himself in clear view, but with cover close at hand. Sheriff Coleman, I see you brought some friends. Worried about facing one man with a rifle? Just being thorough. Your woman got word out before we could stop her, brought federal marshals sniffing around where they don't belong. But that's all right. We'll clean up this mess the same way we've cleaned up all the others. The casual admission of federal crimes, spoken in front of multiple witnesses, was exactly what Marshal Wade needed to justify immediate action. But the plan required Coleman to commit to violence first, to remove any possibility that he might claim self-defense or legal authority for whatever followed. Funny thing about federal marshals, Gideon replied conversationally. They tend to take a dim view of territorial officials who murder federal land grant holders and steal their property. Coleman's laugh was cold as winter steel. Federal marshals got to prove their cases in federal court, Cole, and it's hard to present evidence when all the witnesses are dead and all the documents are burned. You missed some documents, Sheriff, and you missed some witnesses. Did I now? Coleman's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun. Well, that's a mistake I can correct right here and now. It was then that the ranch bell began to toll not the steady rhythm that had once called men to work, but the irregular clanging of metal struck by rifle bullets. The sound echoed off the surrounding cliffs like thunder, carrying a message that could be heard for miles in every direction. The signal brought immediate response from positions throughout the burned ranch. Federal marshals emerged from concealment with their weapons trained on Coleman's forces, their badges now visible and their authority unmistakable. Sheriff Coleman, Marshal Wade's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of federal law. You and your men are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, arson, and violation of federal land grant protections. Surrender your weapons immediately. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two forces faced each other across the scarred landscape. 20-odd corrupt lawmen and hired killers against 12 federal marshal soldiers that might have favored Coleman's people in terms of numbers, but drastically shifted when considerations of training, experience, and legal authority entered the equation. It was Coleman himself who made the choice that sealed his fate. "Federal jurisdiction ends where federal witnesses die," he snarled, drawing his weapon with the speed of a man who had killed many times before. The gunfight that followed was nothing like the romanticized shootouts of dime novels. It was a brief, brutal exchange of professional violence between men who understood that survival depended on accuracy rather than heroics. Coleman's hired guns might have been numerous, but they were accustomed to intimidating farmers and murdering defenseless women, not facing trained federal officers who shot back with deadly precision. Gideon's Winchester spoke first, its distinctive crack echoing off the mountainsides as Coleman's horse stumbled and went down, throwing the corrupt sheriff from his saddle. Miguel appeared from his concealed position among the rocks, his old Springfield rifle proving that age and experience could compensate for inferior numbers. But it was the federal marshals who truly controlled the battlefield. Moving with the coordinated precision of men who had fought together before, they created overlapping fields of fire that turned Coleman's numerical advantage into a liability. Horses screamed and men shouted, but the outcome was never really in doubt. When the shooting stopped, 8 of Coleman's men lay motionless in the ranch yard. 5 others were wounded seriously enough to pose no further threat. The remaining survivors, including 3 legitimate deputies who had been coerced into participating, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Coleman himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but remained conscious and defiant, his face twisted with the rage of a man who had never before faced consequences for his actions. "This won't hold up," he gasped as Marshal Wade approached with shackles. "I got friends in the territorial government, friends in Washington. You can't prove half of what you think you know." "Actually, Sheriff, we can prove all of it." Wade gestured toward Josie, who emerged from her position carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. "Miss Lane recovered quite a collection of evidence from your various hiding places. Letters, financial records, maps showing targeted Property 7 correspondence, with Governor Morrison discussing the elimination of troublesome landowners." The color drained from Coleman's face as he understood the magnitude of his exposure. "That's impossible. We destroyed everything when we burned the ranch." "You destroyed the ranch," Gideon corrected, stepping closer with his rifle still ready. "But we moved the evidence before your attack, hidden it in places your people never thought to look." "You're bluffing." Josie opened the portfolio and withdrew a letter bearing the territorial seal Coleman's own correspondence with Governor Morrison, outlining plans for the accidental deaths of 3 more ranchers whose properties contained valuable mineral deposits. "The Lane woman has become a liability," she read aloud from Coleman's own handwriting. "Her connection to the original homestead grants makes her dangerous if she starts asking legal questions. Recommend immediate elimination using proven methods. That's your signature, Sheriff. Your handwriting. Your orders for my murder." The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and witnessed by federal officers whose testimony would carry weight in any court in the territory. Coleman's conspiracy hadn't just been exposed, it had been documented with the kind of thoroughness that made appeals or political intervention impossible. But the true victory wasn't legal, it was personal. As federal marshals secured the prisoners and began the process of gathering additional evidence from the scene, Josie found herself standing beside the ruins of the ranch house, looking out over land that had been purchased with blood but would now be reclaimed by justice. "It's over," Gideon said quietly, moving up beside her. "Coleman, Morrison, the whole conspiracy, they'll face federal prosecution for crimes that carry death sentences." "Is it really over?" she asked. "Or will there just be other men, other conspiracies, other families destroyed for the sake of mineral wealth and water rights?" "There will always be other men, but now they'll know that some of us fight back, that courage and justice can win against corruption and violence if people are willing to stand together and refuse to be intimidated." As the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had shrouded the mountains. Josie felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death hope for a future that wasn't dominated by fear and survival. The ranch could be rebuilt, the conspiracy had been exposed, and the man she loved had survived to see justice finally served. The war for Blackthorn Ranch was over, but the work of building a life worthy of the sacrifice that had purchased their victory was just beginning. The final confrontation came not with guns and violence, but with a simple gold band that had belonged to a dead woman. As Marshal Wade supervised the loading of prisoners into the transport wagon that would carry them to federal custody, Sheriff Coleman made one last, desperate attempt to escape justice. Breaking free from his shackles with a concealed lockpick, he lunged toward the horses, clearly intending to flee into the mountains where his knowledge of local terrain might give him an advantage over federal pursuit. It was Gideon who stopped him, not with a bullet, but with something far more devastating: the truth. "Sheriff," Gideon called out, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who no longer feared anything his enemies might do. "Before you run, there's something you should see." Coleman paused in his desperate flight, perhaps recognizing something in Gideon's tone that suggested this wasn't a bluff or a trick, but a revelation that would change everything. Gideon reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the morning sunlight: Sarah Mitchell's wedding ring, the one Josie had found in Coleman's macabre collection of trophies. But as he held it up for Coleman to see, the sheriff's reaction wasn't the defiance or anger they expected. It was fear. Pure, undiluted terror that drained the color from his face and made his hands tremble. "You recognize this," Gideon observed, "not just as evidence of your crimes, but as something personal, something that connects you to Sarah Mitchell in ways that go beyond murder." "That's impossible," Coleman whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another victim, was she, Sheriff? She was your daughter." The revelation hit everyone present like a physical blow. Josie felt her breath catch as the implications cascaded through her mind. Marshal Wade's experienced eyes narrowed as he reassessed everything he thought he understood about the case. But it was Coleman's reaction that confirmed the truth. The defiant, corrupt sheriff crumbled before their eyes, becoming something smaller and more pathetic: a man who had murdered his own child in service to his greed. "She wouldn't listen," Coleman said, his voice barely audible. "Wouldn't take the money I offered, wouldn't leave quietly when I explained what was at stake. She said she'd rather die than be part of what I was doing to innocent people." "So you killed her," Josie said, understanding flooding through her. "Your own daughter, because she threatened your conspiracy. She was going to expose everything. 20 years of careful planning, millions of dollars in mineral rights, the future of the entire territory, all of it, would have been destroyed because one stubborn girl couldn't understand the bigger picture." The admission was complete, witnessed by federal officers and documented beyond any possibility of denial. But more than legal evidence, it was a window into the kind of moral corruption that made men capable of unthinkable acts. "And Elena?" Gideon pressed. "Margaret, were they obstacles to your bigger picture too?" "Elena found Sarah's body before I could move it, saw the marks that proved it wasn't an accident. Margaret discovered correspondence that connected me to Mountain Territory development." Coleman's voice carried the hollow tone of a man confessing sins too great for redemption. "They all had to die. The conspiracy was too important, the stakes too high for individual lives to matter. What about the parents of your victims, the families destroyed by your greed? Acceptable casualties in a larger conflict. This territory is sitting on mineral wealth that could make us all rich beyond imagining, but only if it's developed systematically by people with vision and courage enough to do what's necessary." Marshal Wade stepped forward, his face a mask of professional disgust. "Sheriff Coleman, you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, including the murder of your own daughter. You have—" But there was one more revelation that needed to be made, one final truth that would determine whether the conspiracy died with Coleman's arrest or continued under new leadership. "The governor," Josie said, studying Coleman's face. "Governor Morrison Hay doesn't know about Sarah, does he? Doesn't know you killed your own daughter to protect his conspiracy." Coleman's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of the cunning that had made him so dangerous. Morrison knows what he needs to know, that obstacles were removed, that the plan proceeded on schedule. The details of how that happened, those were my responsibility. Which means he's vulnerable, Gideon realized. If Morrison learns that his trusted sheriff has been murdering family members, including his own daughter, it destroys any possibility of political protection. Even corrupt politicians draw the line at child murder. The strategy that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Coleman's confession would be documented and transmitted to territorial authorities, but not as evidence of his guilt, as evidence of his insanity. A sheriff who murdered his own daughter for money was clearly mentally incompetent, which made all his previous actions and testimony legally questionable. Morrison, faced with the choice between protecting a madman whose crimes could destroy them both or abandoning Coleman to federal justice, would almost certainly choose self-preservation over loyalty. "You're going to testify," Marshal Wade informed Coleman, "against Morrison, against Mountain Territory Development, against everyone who participated in this conspiracy. In exchange, you'll face life imprisonment instead of hanging. And if I refuse, then you hang for multiple murders, including the murder of your daughter, and we build our case against the others, using the evidence we've already gathered. Either way, the conspiracy ends. The only question is whether you live to see it." As federal marshals prepared to transport their prisoners to Denver for trial, Josie found herself standing beside the ruins of the ranch house, holding Sarah Mitchell's wedding ring. The simple gold band seemed to contain the weight of all the injustice that had been done, all the lives lost to other men's greed. "She would have been my sister-in-law," she said quietly as Gideon joined her. "If things had worked out differently, if Coleman hadn't killed her, Sarah might have become part of our family." "She's part of it anyway," Gideon replied, taking the ring from her hands. "Her courage, her refusal to be intimidated or bought, that's what made this victory possible. She didn't die for nothing, Josie. She died fighting for something larger than herself, and we finished the fight she started." As the sun reached its zenith, burning away the last of the morning mist, they buried Sarah's ring beneath a cairn of stones where the ranch house porch had once stood. It wasn't a grave. Sarah's body had been laid to rest months earlier in the town cemetery, but it was a memorial to the idea that some things were worth dying for and worth living for. The conspiracy that had killed her was broken, its leaders facing federal prosecution and its network of corruption exposed to the cleansing light of justice. But more than that, her death had brought together the people who would ensure that such conspiracies could never again flourish in the shadow of the Devil's Backbone Range. The war was over. The work of healing could finally begin. 6 months later, the sound that woke Josie Cole before dawn wasn't gunfire or the tramp of hostile boots, but the gentle lowing of cattle returning to pastures that had been empty too long. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes that had become her uniform, sturdy boots, work dress, and the simple gold band that marked her as Gideon's wife and partner in rebuilding what had been destroyed. The new ranch house was smaller than its predecessor, but built with the kind of careful attention to detail that spoke of permanence rather than mere shelter. Every board had been chosen and placed by hands that understood the value of honest work, every stone in the foundation laid by people who intended this structure to stand for generations. From the front porch, she could see the wooden sign that had replaced the old ranch marker, Cole Lane Ranch, carved in letters deep enough to weather decades of mountain storms. The name itself told a story of survival and transformation, of two people who had found in each other the strength to face impossible odds and emerge victorious. Gideon emerged from the barn as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern peaks, leading a horse that bore no resemblance to the battle-scarred animals that had survived Coleman's siege. This was a young mare, strong and healthy, bred for the kind of ranch work that built prosperity rather than mere survival. "Morning, Mrs. Cole," he said with the smile that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," she replied honestly. No nightmares, no sounds of approaching danger. Just the peace of knowing that tomorrow will be better than today. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The trials of Sheriff Coleman and Governor Morrison had taken months to complete, their revelations exposing corruption that reached far beyond the territorial government into federal bureaucracies and private corporations. Coleman had ultimately testified against his co-conspirators in exchange for life imprisonment, but Morrison had chosen to face the gallows rather than admit his participation in systematic murder. Mountain Territory development had been dissolved by federal order, its assets seized and redistributed to the families who had been victimized by the conspiracy. The Blackthorn Ranch itself had been confirmed as legally belonging to Gideon, with additional water rights granted in recognition of the mineral wealth that made the property so valuable. But the most important transformation was personal rather than legal. Tommy Lane had arrived at the ranch in early spring, his lungs finally healed enough by the mountain air to allow normal childhood activities. At 12 years old, he had adapted to ranch life with the resilience that seemed to run in his family, becoming Miguel's eager apprentice in everything from horse care to the finer points of frontier survival. Miguel himself had aged visibly during the siege, but his recovery had been remarkable once the constant threat of violence was removed. His wooden rosary still hung from his belt, but now it served as a symbol of gratitude rather than desperate prayer. "Senora," Miguel said as he approached the house carrying fresh eggs from the chicken coop they had rebuilt. "The boy, he asks again about learning to use the rifle. Says he is old enough now to help protect the ranch if trouble comes again." Josie and Gideon exchanged a glance that contained volumes of shared understanding. Tommy's request wasn't born of bloodthirsty ambition but of genuine love for the place that had become his home and the people who had become his family. "He's old enough to learn responsibility," Gideon said finally, "but the kind of responsibility that prevents trouble rather than responding to it. Teach him to shoot, Miguel, but teach him to think first." The morning routine that followed was familiar but never tedious, checking the livestock, examining the crops that would provide both sustenance and profit, maintaining the structures and systems that made civilized life possible in the wilderness. But there was a quality to the work now that hadn't existed during the siege, the satisfaction of building rather than merely surviving. It was while Josie was working in the vegetable garden that the sound of approaching riders drew her attention to the main trail. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle she still kept within easy reach. But the tension faded as she recognized the familiar figure of Dr. Patterson riding alongside two women she didn't immediately identify. Mrs. Cole," Dr. Patterson called out with obvious pleasure. "I hope you don't mind unexpected visitors. I've brought some people who wanted to meet the woman who brought down Coleman's conspiracy." The two women with him dismounted with the careful grace of people accustomed to long rides. The older of the two, perhaps 40 years of age, bore a striking resemblance to someone Josie couldn't quite place. The younger woman, barely out of her teens, carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that Josie recognized from her own reflection. "Mrs. Cole," the older woman said, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Catherine Mitchell, Sarah's aunt, and this is my daughter Mary. We wanted to thank you for what you did for ensuring that Sarah's death wasn't forgotten or dismissed as just another frontier accident." The connection hit Josie like a revelation. Sarah Mitchell, the first woman to die at Blackthorn Ranch, had family who had survived to see justice done. The resemblance she had noticed was to the portrait Gideon had shown her months earlier, the same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes. "Your niece was a brave woman," Josie replied, accepting Catherine's handshake. "She died trying to do the right thing, trying to protect others from the same fate. That courage's what made our victory possible." "Dr. Patterson told us about the memorial you built," Mary said quietly. "The cairn of stones where her ring is buried. Would it be possible for us to visit it?" The walk to the memorial site became an impromptu ceremony of remembrance and healing. Catherine and Mary had brought wildflowers from the valley where Sarah had grown up, and they placed them carefully around the stone cairn while sharing memories of a woman whose death had seemed meaningless until its larger purpose was revealed. She always said she wanted to make a difference, Catherine recalled, her voice thick with emotion. Wanted to leave the world better than she found it. I never imagined that her death would lead to the exposure of so much corruption and the salvation of so many other families. She did make a difference, Gideon said, joining the group at the memorial. Every family that won't be driven from their land, every woman who won't be murdered for inconveniencing powerful men, that's Sarah's legacy. As afternoon faded toward evening, the visitors departed with promises to return and plans to establish a more permanent memorial to the victims of Coleman's conspiracy. But it was the conversation that followed their departure that revealed the true depth of the transformation that had occurred. "Tommy asked me something today," Josie said as she and Gideon sat on their new porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. "He wanted to know if we're going to have children of our own, and if so, whether we'll name one of them Sarah." "What did you tell him?" "That Sarah's memory will always be part of our family, but that our children will have their own names and their own destinies. That the best way to honor the dead is to make sure the living have the chance to build something beautiful." Gideon took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers as they had on that first night when they'd finally acknowledged their love for each other. "And do you want children, Mrs. Cole? Are you ready to bring new life into a world that's proven capable of such violence?" "I'm ready to bring new life into a world where people like us are willing to fight for justice," she replied. "Where courage can triumph over corruption, where love can survive, even the worst that men can do to each other." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy appeared from the barn where he had been helping Miguel with the evening chores. At 12, he was already showing signs of the man he would become, tall like his sister, but with the broad shoulders and steady hands that came from honest work. "Josie," he said, using the informal address that had evolved from their new family dynamic. "Miguel says the territorial government is offering rewards for information about other corruption. Says there might be enough money to send me to school in Denver if we wanted. Is that what you want, Tommy? To leave the ranch for school?" The boy considered the question with the gravity that important decisions deserved. "I want to learn things that will make me useful here," he said finally. "Books and numbers and law, so that nobody can ever take advantage of our family the way they tried to take advantage of us." It was a mature answer from someone who had learned hard lessons about the relationship between knowledge and power. But more than that, it was a sign that the next generation would be better prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. As full darkness settled over the ranch, they gathered in the main room of their new house of space, designed for family rather than defense, with large windows that welcomed light instead of gun ports that anticipated attack. The evening meal was simple but abundant. Conversation focused on plans and possibilities rather than fears and survival. And when the day's work was finally done, when Tommy had been tucked into bed and Miguel had retired to his own quarters, Josie and Gideon found themselves alone with the peace that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, as they prepared for sleep. "Coming to this cursed ranch, getting involved in a war that wasn't really yours?" "Every day," she replied, then smiled at his surprised expression. "I regret that it took a conspiracy and multiple murders to bring us together. I regret that Sarah and Elena and Margaret had to die before we found the strength to fight back. I regret that my parents were killed for the crime of owning valuable land." She moved closer to him, her hand resting over his heart, where she could feel its steady rhythm. "But I don't regret fighting, I don't regret surviving, and I don't regret falling in love with a man stubborn enough to stand against impossible odds when standing was the right thing to do." Outside their window, the mountain peaks stood eternal and unchanging, but the land beneath them had been transformed by the choices made by ordinary people who refused to accept that evil was stronger than good. The Devil's Backbone Range would always be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was no longer a place where the innocent were murdered with impunity or where corruption could flourish in darkness. The curse that had haunted Blackthorn Ranch was broken not by supernatural intervention, but by the oldest kind of magic, the power of people who loved each other enough to fight for something larger than themselves. And in the morning, they would continue the work of building a life worthy of the price that had been paid for their freedom, secure in the knowledge that some victories, once won, could never be taken away.